And welcome to the first virtual information session for aspiring candidates hosted by Edmonton Elections. My name is Chris Hayward, and I'll be moderating today's session. Joining me today is Aileen Giesbrecht, Returning Officer and City Clerk for the City of Edmonton. At this time, we acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of Treaty 6 territory and the traditional Métis homeland of Region 4. We acknowledge the diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footsteps have marked this territory for centuries, from First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and now settlers from around the world. We do this to create awareness that we are all treaty members and to show recognition and respect for Indigenous peoples and the traditional territories on which we live and work. Together, we call upon all of our collective honored traditions and spirits to work in building a great city for today and future generations. Turning to today, this presentation is expected to last between 20 and 30 minutes, and we will take your questions during the presentation and afterwards. You can submit those by emailing them to elections@edmonton.ca. A recording of this presentation and a frequently asked questions document will be available on our website, edmonton.ca/elections, following this session. During the next few months, Edmonton Elections will be sharing information for aspiring candidates in multiple ways. Virtual information sessions will cover topics such as general information and nominations, campaign financing, campaigning, and election day and post-election processes. In addition, edmonton.ca/elections will host comprehensive information, including forms and updates. If after visiting our website you still have questions, please email us at elections@edmonton.ca or send us a message on Twitter at EDMElections. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aileen, Returning Officer for the City of Edmonton, to guide us through the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon to everybody. I'd like to say thank you for joining us today. And as Chris was mentioning, throughout the next sort of 20 to 25 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking a lot about we and us. And I just wanted to explain who we and us actually are. We're the Edmonton election team. We're a team that starts out as 4 people. And over the course of the election planning cycle, we actually grow into a mighty team of 3,000. We're the team that plan and execute the 2021 Edmonton general election on behalf of the City of Edmonton, the Edmonton School Division, and the Edmonton Catholic Separate School Division. We operate in accordance with both provincial and municipal legislative requirements. We're prioritizing 3 opportunities, and we're going to talk to one of those opportunities today. We want to encourage Edmontonians to vote in the election, to run in the election, which is why the aspiring candidates you've joined us today. And we also want to talk to you at future sessions about applying to work in the election. And all that we do follows the four principles listed on your screen: accessible, inclusive, equitable, and ethical. So I think all of you probably have already figured out that the election day is going to be next October 18th, which is a Monday, 2021. It's not far away now. So votes are going to be cast on that day at approximately 200 voting stations, plus advanced voting locations, and also through special mail-in ballots. So I want to spend a little bit of time now introducing the general structure of the election before we look at some of the more detailed parts and processes for you as aspiring candidates. And as I mentioned already, next October, Edmonton is going to elect a city council and a board of trustees for the Edmonton School Division, as well as a board of trustees for the Edmonton Catholic Separate School Division. The residents of Edmonton are represented by a city council made up of the mayor and 12 councillors. That's 1 councillor for each of the 12 municipal wards. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the wards later in the presentation. Councillors and the mayor both serve 4-year terms. All eligible electors who participate in the Edmonton election can cast a vote for mayor. Councillors are elected by voters in the wards that they seek to represent. The Edmonton School Division is divided into 9 wards, and each of those wards is also represented by a trustee, one of whom will ultimately be elected as chair. There are 7 Edmonton Catholic Separate School Division wards, and again, each is represented by a trustee. From those trustees, it will be that group that elects the chair. The trustees in the school divisions, just like the councillors and the mayor, all serve a 4-year term. So we've talked about the date, we've talked about the positions in the election. Now I want to talk a little bit about the roles and responsibilities. Now there are some things that are similar for all the elected officials, but there are also some important differences. So the first act I want to talk about that guides our roles and responsibilities is the Municipal Government Act, or as we call it, the MGA. And it really shapes how municipalities operate and makes mentions of the duties of the mayor and of the councillors. So councillors, including the mayor, consider the welfare and interests of the city as a whole and bring to council's attention anything that would promote the city's interests. So practically speaking, this means working with residents, city staff and administration, other members of council, and key stakeholders to develop and evaluate policies and programs that benefit all of Edmonton. The mayor has all of those same responsibilities, but also serves as the chairperson of council and liaises with other orders of government. You'll sometimes see the mayor referred to as the chief elected official, particularly if you're starting to look at some of the legislative documents that guide the election process. The boards of trustees for both the Catholic and the public school board make decisions regarding the direction of the quality of local public education. Amongst other roles, the trustees act as the communicators, planners, policymakers, and advocates. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you about some of the key election dates. The first dates I want to talk to you about is the actual nomination period itself. So that is right around the corner, and that starts on January 4th, and it concludes on September 20th, 2021. So any individual who intends to participate in the Edmonton election as a candidate must complete the nomination process during this period. We're going to talk about how to do that later on in the presentation, but just be aware of those dates from January 4th to the 20th of September. And I just want to pause and have a quick note on this nomination period before we move forward, just in case if any of your aspiring candidates out there have ever ran in previous elections in 2017, 2013, or as I did starting in 2010 and 2007. Previously, candidates submitted their nomination forms on a single day at City Hall. So there was one single nomination day. It was in the September before the election. Those interested in running for office now, however, have a significantly longer period of time to submit their forms and pay the deposit. You can do so, as I said, starting January 4th. We'll explain why there's been a change in a few minutes. The nomination period is not the same thing as the campaign period. You might wonder why. Well, the campaign period runs from January 1st to December 31st, a full calendar year. And it is during this period of time that candidates can raise funds to support their campaigns. Only candidates that have filed their nomination papers can actually raise funds during this period. Individuals can also raise funds outside the campaign period, but that amount of money cannot exceed $5,000 per year. So we're going to go into greater detail about the campaign period at our next virtual information session, and we're going to tell you the date of that at the end of this presentation, so you need to hang on till the end. But in the meantime, if you're looking for a bit more information, please check out our website at edmonton.ca/elections. The third date on your screen we've already talked about is October 18th. That date is actually set by the legislation in the Local Authorities Election Act. And the fourth date I want to flag for you is March 1st, 2022. That is the campaign disclosure statement deadline. All candidates must report the total contributions they receive and their total campaign expenses. This is the form that's used to report the full campaign disclosure statement. It's a very, very important date that you need to remember. That's why we're mentioning it now, so there's no surprises after the election next year. So that gives you a high-level overview of the plan that we've got so far for the 2021 Edmonton general election. Now I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the governing legislation that is the legislation that we must comply with as we're planning the election for next October. So I already mentioned this, but the Municipal Government Act, which is the MGA, really shapes how municipalities operate within the province. So the MGA states very clearly that elections must be conducted in accordance with the Local Authorities Election Act. The LAEA, which I sometimes get the acronym wrong, so we'll just call it the Election Act, it actually outlines the election rules for municipalities and school board trustee elections. It has a significant bearing on our work, as the procedures, process, and the materials that we develop as the Edmonton elections team must be compliant with this act. There are a number of significant requirements and regulations related specifically to candidates in this Election Act. So if you do choose to file nomination papers, you really need to spend some time looking through this document and making sure that you're abiding by all of the regulations, and all of this information is on our website. This Election Act is a complex legal document, and we are very happy to take your calls and questions today and after the sessions at the election office, either by calling us or by sending us an email. But I just need to state for absolute clarity that our responses are not legal advice. And if you need to get further clarification, we recommend that you seek your own legal counsel. But as I mentioned earlier, some of the election processes have changed since the last election, and nomination day is just one of those such changes. Because of these amendments made to the Local Authorities Election Act, even just recently by the government, there's a number of things that have changed that I just want to highlight for you here today. These changes relate to the nomination process, campaign contributions and expenses, and the third-party advertising requirements. We're going to talk a little bit about some of those changes, predominantly the nomination process today. And in some of our upcoming sessions, we're going to be addressing some of the other changes that have happened since the last election in 2017. So I talked about the MGA, I've talked about the Local Authorities Election Act. The other act I need to mention to you today is the Education Act. This act contains the specific regulations for candidates to become a trustee for the Edmonton School Division and the Edmonton Separate Catholic School Division. The election processes for both of these elections are governed by the Local Authorities Election Act. And the fourth document that we rely heavily on as we're planning our election is the City of Edmonton Election Bylaw. So the Election Act I mentioned a few slides ago actually permits municipalities to establish some of their own election criteria through a bylaw. Council just recently approved its bylaw for the next election. We're going to look at some of the changes in addition to the nomination process, so the signatures and the deposits. It also has approved specific voting procedures, voting hours, special ballots, and ballot counting. And we'll talk all about that at a future session. But in the meantime, if you'd like to take a look at our election bylaw, that's available also for you on the elections website. And if you happen to have any questions about all of these documents or any of the supplementary material that's available on our website, you do have additional resources that you can contact. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking to you here about the Edmonton's election team. So if you have questions about the nomination process, campaign regulations, what to expect on election day, and post-election services, please reach out to us at elections@edmonton.ca. If you've got any questions about candidates or voter eligibility, again, we'll talk a little bit about some of that coming up. You need to contact Municipal Affairs, and their contact information is also on the screen. Now, Elections Alberta is an independent office within the Legislative Assembly, and they are responsible for administering provincial elections and by-elections. They are not the ones that run the municipal elections. We do that on behalf of the City of Edmonton, as I mentioned before. Elections Alberta receives complaints regarding campaign financing and contributions, and you can reach them by emailing complaints@elections.ab.ca. So we've talked about the legislation and we've talked about the high-level process for the elections, and now we want to dive into what you're probably most interested about, which is the actual nomination process. We're going to go through this in a bit more detail. So as I mentioned a couple slides ago, the nomination period starts January 4th and it runs all the way to September 20th. So individuals who intend to participate in the election next October as a candidate must file the nomination papers during, as I've already mentioned, the nomination period. You're not considered an actual candidate until your nomination papers have been received by either myself or a member of our team and the necessary deposit has actually been received. There's two steps there. You're going to see a list of requirements on the slide, and we're going to take a look at each of these requirements in just a minute. But before we do, I just want to reiterate that in an election year, so that's next year, candidates can only fundraise and receive campaign contributions once you filed your nomination papers. You can receive contributions outside of an election year to support your upcoming campaigns, but you can't raise any more than $5,000 per year. But again, we're going to discuss campaign financing in our next session, but just wanted to highlight that for you again here. So we've nailed down the nomination period. Now let's talk about your eligibility as a candidate. So the Local Authorities Election Act describes the eligibility criteria that individuals must meet in order to register as a candidate. So up on the screen, it's quite clear you have to be 18 years old, you have to be a Canadian citizen, and you have to be a resident of Edmonton for the 6 consecutive months prior to nomination day, which is September 20th. Nomination day, which marks the end of the nomination period, not the start, is the 4 weeks before election day. So for the upcoming Edmonton general election, nomination day is September 20th. Just a quick reminder, you don't have to wait until the last day to file your papers, but if you decide to file your papers on the 22nd of September, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to take them. So just a reminder to remember the nomination period. So we've talked about what your eligibility criteria is. We also do need to talk about some reasons that you might be ineligible to put your papers in. So the Election Act describes is the act that describes the criteria that would make you ineligible, regardless of whether you meet the 3 criteria that we talked about on the previous slide. So you're ineligible to participate in an election for city council or to be the mayor if you currently work for the city of Edmonton as an employee. If you are an employee of the city of Edmonton and you want to run in the next municipal election, you must take a leave of absence in order for you to be considered eligible. And if you have any questions about that, I'd encourage you to reach out to your supervisor. You're also ineligible to run in the next school board elections if you are currently an employee of a school division, charter school, or a private school. This only applies to individuals who want to run in either of the school division trustee elections. And again, a leave of absence is required. And again, would suggest you to talk to the school board and your supervisor. A couple of other reasons I just would like to highlight for you is if you happen to owe the city of Edmonton more than $50 in taxes, with the exception of the current tax year, you're ineligible to put in your nomination papers. Or if you owe the city of Edmonton more than $500 for any other reason and you're more than 90 days in arrears, you're ineligible to be a candidate. There's a couple of other reasons that you might be ineligible, and that's if you've been convicted of an offense under certain legislative acts. Please note that the list on the screens listed out in sections 21 to 24 of the Act is not a complete list. It's just the most common ways that you might find yourselves to be ineligible. We strongly encourage you to refer to these sections in the Act for a more comprehensive list on eligibility criteria. And a reminder that if you do need to get additional advice regarding your eligibility, we suggest you seek independent legal advice to help navigate your way through that decision. So we've talked about eligibility and ineligibility. Now we want to talk about the nitty-gritty of the actual nomination requirements. So the City of Edmonton election bylaw is the one that actually requires individuals who want to file their nomination papers to collect signatures from residents and pay a deposit. Remember the 2 steps I talked about. The number of signatures required and the amount of the deposit varies depending on the office that the candidate is seeking election to. So if you would like to run for the position of mayor, you need to have 100 signatures from residents. Those signatures must be made on the official nomination form. We're going to talk about the form in a few minutes. Residents must meet certain criteria in order to provide a signature to mayoral candidates. Anybody signing a nomination form must be a resident of Edmonton. They must be an eligible voter in the Edmonton general election the day they sign the form. And this means you have to be 18 years old. I've said this before. The Canadian citizen and their place of residence must be located in Edmonton on the day of the election. And it is not up to Edmonton elections, but rather the candidate's responsibility to make sure that anybody that's signing your nomination form meets the proper criteria. In addition to getting the form filled out, you also need to provide a deposit. And if you're wanting to be a candidate for mayor, you also must provide a $500 deposit. The deposit must be provided at the same time you're filing your papers with us. And I need to highlight this. The deposits can only be made with cash, certified check, or money order. This isn't a decision the City of Edmonton or the Edmonton elections team made, but it's a requirement in the Election Act. So if you don't show up with your cash, certified check, or money order, we aren't going to be able to accept your papers. All of this, again, is on the website, but we wanted to highlight that for you today. Now on to the requirements for counselors and school division trustees. So the requirements for candidates for council and school division trustees are quite similar to those that we just looked at, but there are a few differences. Rather than requiring 100 signatures, you only need to get 25. Those residents must be eligible voters when they sign the form. I've said this, but I'll say it again. You have to be 18 years old, have to be a Canadian citizen, and the place of residence must be in Edmonton on election day. But those individuals must also be a resident of the ward in which the candidate seeks election. This is a really important point to note. And again, it's the candidate's responsibility to make sure that residents who provide the signature meet the required criteria. Now, the deposit required to be a candidate as a city councillor or a school division trustee is $100, again, made payable by cash, certified check, or money order. So we've talked about the nomination requirements and eligibility. Now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about ward boundaries. So Edmonton is divided into 12 municipal wards. On our website, you're going to currently find the ward maps for this council term, 2017 to 2021. The current boundaries use a numbering system of 1 to 12. Last year, an independent ward boundary commission was set up by bylaw. They completed their analysis made up of a group of volunteers and experts, and they presented their recommendations of new ward boundaries to City Council in May of this year. Based on their recommendation and analysis, Council directed the Edmonton elections team to create a new bylaw incorporating the new recommended ward boundaries. We did that work and we returned to Council earlier in the year. To date, Council has approved one of the 3 required readings to change the boundaries that will come into effect on October 18th, 2021, so the next election, if they do receive the next 2 readings before the end of this calendar year. Now, the names of the wards may also be changing from numbers to that of Indigenous names. Council will also be making that decision in December, on December 7th of this year. This is really important for those candidates seeking election as a city councillor, because as I mentioned before, residents signing those nomination papers must reside in the ward in which the candidate is seeking election. So it's something you might want to think about before you start having your forms completed, is you may want to circle December 7th in your calendars, because that's the date when we're actually going to know which ward boundaries were going to come into effect for the election next year. The ward boundaries for both the Edmonton School Division and the Edmonton Separate Catholic School Division have also changed. And once those maps are available, you can also find those on our website. So moving on from ward boundaries, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the forms I keep mentioning, the actual nomination forms. So it's really important that these forms are completed correctly. We can only receive them if they're completed fully and accurately. It's also important to note that only official nomination forms will be received. Can't make homemade versions, unfortunately, but to make this really easy for yourself, there are PDF versions available on our website for easy to print out. And if you have challenges printing them out, you can contact our office and we can work with you to make sure you get the right forms. It's also really important that you actually download and use the right forms when you're collecting your signatures. There are different forms if you're running for mayor, or if you're running for city councillor, or if you're running for the Edmonton School Division or the Edmonton Catholic School Division. So you may say, well, I'm running for council. Can't I just use the form with a C on it? No, that's the one for council. The one for M is the one for mayor. And again, as I mentioned, there's 2 separate forms depending on what trustee election you're running in. Another part that I want to highlight for you about the forms is the forms actually have to be submitted in person. Now, this is the part where I have to say we don't have all of the answers worked out. We've got the forms, we've got the rules, we're figuring out the ward boundary maps in December, but the piece that we're still working through is the logistics for where you submit your forms, what hours in the day you can submit the forms, and what's required to make sure that we're maintaining the health and safety of our employees and the members of our team, but also of you and your volunteers. So we're working very diligently to create the appropriate processes so that everybody can file their papers safely. And we know that you have lots of questions about this, and we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding as we work through the next steps in this process. I don't have all of the details worked out right now, but the best thing to do is to follow our Twitter feed or to come back to the Edmonton Elections webpage in a couple of weeks, and we'll have more information available for you on how to actually fill in these forms and where to submit them. And with that, I think we've taken you on a whirlwind tour of Election 101 and nomination filing. And just before I go back to Chris to take your questions, I would just like to very much thank the election team, as well as our communications and engagement partners who've made this possible so far. And with that, Chris, I'll stop presenting and turn it back over to yourself.
Great, thank you. Lots of information to unpack there. We hope you find it helpful. I do want to reiterate that the session is going to be available on the city's YouTube channel and on our page, edmonton.ca/election. So if you're trying to scribble everything down frantically as Aileen was talking, don't worry, there are other opportunities for you to circle back and get that information again. Thank you to those of you that have been submitting questions as we've been working through the presentation. A lot of great ones. We won't have time to get to them all today, unfortunately, but we will be posting an FAQ on the website as soon as we're done here. We'll continue to add to that as we work through the elections process, but we do have time to get to some now. Aileen, I want to take you back to the ward boundary piece because that's important, but it's also really complicated. So if you could summarize again for us, when we expect decisions to be made regarding change, when those changes are going to be in effect, and what the implications for candidates are.
Okay, fair enough. So Council will be discussing the new ward boundary bylaw, which includes the geographical locations and the names. That's going to be on the December 7th City Council agenda. So that agenda will be going out on December 2nd or 3rd. I'm not sure what the Thursday is. So that's where to find that information. During that meeting, Council will then either give second or third reading to the bylaw. If it does receive the required readings, those changes will come into effect for the next election. So that's October 2021. Now that does seem quite a ways off, but the reason you care if you're an aspiring candidate, it's those new wards that you'll have to be going to get the signatures for your nomination forms. So just to reiterate, December 7th, we should get clarity on the ward boundaries and the names. It comes into effect on October 21st next year, and it's the new ward boundaries, if approved, that you need to go to get the signatures if you're running in the trustee election or if you're running to be a city councillor. It doesn't impact you if you're running to be the mayor. Does that help, Chris?
Okay. Yes, I think so. Thank you. So December 7th, the decision made. If that bylaw is passed, changes come into effect on election day. So if I'm a resident, my councillor stays the same. The neighborhoods that are in my current ward, those remain unchanged until the date of the next election, when things may look different depending on council's decision.
100%. There's no changes to this council or the this year.
But if I'm a candidate, I need to be thinking about what things will look like post-election 2021. So I need to collect signatures from residents who live in the ward that seek to represent after the next election.
100%.
Okay, it's complicated. One thing I want to add, and you can tell this is important because I'm waving my pen, but if you are a candidate for council, you do not need to reside in the ward in which you seek election. You do need to collect signatures from those residents, but you yourself can live wherever you choose, provided you live in Edmonton.
Correct. I did. You flagged that. I forgot to mention that earlier, but you're absolutely right, Chris.
Okay. Well, now we think we've cleared that up. I want to take us back to the actual process of filling out the forms and the requirements there. You mentioned a lot of this has to be done in person, but obviously being mindful of the current health situation, can collect signatures from residents electronically, or does that have to be done in person?
Great question, and it's a question I've received in the last couple of months, definitely since COVID's changed a lot of our practices at City Hall. Unfortunately, the rules that are set out within the Election Act do not allow electronic signatures. So whether you're running for mayor and you need 100 signatures, or you're running for trustee or city councilor position, the signatures that go on your paper form, they do actually have to be handwritten, no stamps and no electronic signature.
Okay, and this is where this extended nomination period probably helps candidates. You have time to go out and collect things as we work through this ever-changing situation. So I've downloaded my forms as a candidate. I'm looking through them. You've reiterated a number of times that accuracy and comprehensiveness when completing these forms is really important. So do I have to do these by myself? I know that I have to submit them in person, but when I'm actually filling the forms out, is there anywhere that I can seek advice as I'm going through that process?
The election team is happy to answer any of your questions. But if you were looking for a member of the election team to come out with you and help you answer questions of potential voters or help you get the forms themselves completed with signatures, we're not able to do that. But when your forms are completed and you bring them in with your deposit, if we see something that's not quite right on the form, that's when we can give you some feedback. Or if you've got specific questions in advance, give our office a call. But again, when it comes to eligibility criteria or any other legal advice, we're not in a position to provide that. So you really do need to reach out and get some independent legal counsel.
Right. But good to know that I don't have to sit there on my own and try and navigate my way through this.
Just call us.
Just call us. So I've filled out my nomination paper. I'm confident that I've done it correctly. I didn't make it myself at home. I have the right form. I've gone through the process of submitting it. It's January the 5th. I've submitted my form on the 4th, but I wake up in the night in a cold sweat. I'm thinking this isn't for me. Can I back out or am I locked in now?
That's a really good question, and I didn't address that in the presentation. You can file your papers and then change your mind 100%. In fact, you have an opportunity to withdraw your nomination papers up until 24 hours after the close of nomination day. So you have up until the September 21st. But I would suggest if you decide in April or May or even earlier in September that you've decided this just isn't for you, reach out to our office and we can navigate you through the process.
Okay, great. You talked about nomination period. You talked about campaign period. One thing that we've had some questions on, and I can understand why this is confusing, it seems like campaign period starts before the nomination period. You talked about how campaign period begins on January the 1st, but I can file my nomination period, my nomination papers as of January the 4th. So perhaps you can explain why that discrepancy exists.
Great question. As I mentioned, the campaign period is the full calendar year. So if you wanted to file your nomination papers at the beginning of the campaign period, which is January 1st, fortunately, we're not open. We're not open on the 2nd or the 3rd. So the reason we've got the 4th is that's the first business day that we're back in the office after the statutory public holiday. It's pretty much that simple.
Well, that makes sense. I think, looking at our inbox, I think we've covered most of the questions that have come in here today. Thank you for taking the opportunity to listen to us, to learn more about what it means to be a candidate in the Edmonton general election. We've talked about this a lot, but it bears repeating. Our website is a great resource to you as a candidate. Please do check it frequently. Bookmark it in your browser if you haven't already. Follow us on Twitter, EDM Election, and sign up for our candidate emails. We haven't talked about that, but there is a distribution list that you can make yourself a part of where we'll circulate information as it becomes available. So check our website for that. Breaking news, Aileen, maybe you weren't aware of this, but our next session is going to be on December the 14th. So probably should have checked with a number of people before I announced
that. Make sure that we were all available. Chris and I have arbitrarily decided that's when we're having our next session.
Yeah, we're locked in. So
Surprise.
We're good. Everyone else will have to fit in around us. So please mark your calendars for that. If you found this useful, we're sure that you'll find the second information session useful as well. We're going to focus there on campaigning. We'll talk about contributions. We'll talk about third-party advertising. We'll talk about expenses. So please do join us for that. And with that, thank you again, Aileen. And thanks to you folks for joining us. We hope you'll do so again soon.